Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My guest today is Tom Standage, Deputy Editor of The Economist and the editor of The World Ahead. He's also a drummer and describes himself as the least musical member of a musical family. He's authored several history books, including A History of the World in Six Glasses, among my all-time favorites. Today, he joins us to talk about his most recent book, published in 2021, A Brief History of Motion from the Wheel to the Car to What Comes Next. Thanks, Tom, for joining in.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Thank you. Tom, one of the most baffling things that I read from your book is that it wasn't entirely evident to mankind until centuries after the wheel was invented that you could do something with it. Meaning, you write that it was invented back in 3600 BC, and only until 1800 did we have anything remotely horse-drawn carriages, was it, or wooden vehicles that were pulled by animals. So what took so long? So Flintstones were wrong then to showcase what they did.
Yeah, the Flintstones are definitely wrong. That's true. So no, the wheel was invented probably about 3500 BC, and some people were using it right away. The people who invented it, it looks like it may have been used in mining in Central Europe. So you make a basket and you're dragging all of this ore around, so it kind of makes sense to put wheels on the bottom of the basket. So that's possibly where it appears first, and then it does spread very quickly. It spreads around the top of the Black Sea to Mesopotamia, and so you then see, within a few hundred years, there are images of wheeled vehicles in Mesopotamia, and it looks as though there were agricultural vehicles using wheels. They didn't have steering, but they were sort of basic carts. You could roll them up and down. You could use them for bringing stuff in from the field. So that was all happening quite quickly. What is striking, though, is even though and in fact, if you've seen it, you could travel a long way and then you could tell someone else how to make one. That's not something you could do with, say, a metal working technique or an agricultural technique. Just seeing it isn't enough, but with a wheel, seeing it is enough. What's striking then is that the idea spreads very quickly, but there are entire civilizations that choose not to use it, most notably the Egyptians. And the Egyptians build, the pyramids and everything without using any wheels at all. And it's just because for them, it didn't make any sense. They had the Nile, and Egyptian culture was very concentrated along the River Nile. And the easiest way to move things around was just putting them on rafts on the Nile. And the easiest way to move things around on the sand was to roll them on rollers, not to use wheels. And in fact, no wheeled vehicle in the world at that point would have been able to carry one of those blocks that was used in the making of the pyramid. So the Egyptians they just looked at the wheel and thought, yeah, that's very cool, but we can't see the point. And it's only, as you say, a bit later, about 1800 BC, when the Hittites, who are a culture to the north of Egypt, invent the war chariot. And this is a much smaller, lighter vehicle than the agricultural carts that have been used up to that point. The war chariot is then a real danger to the Egyptians because the Hittites conquer much of the region. And suddenly the Egyptians are like, okay, now we can see the point of this. So then they get really into war chariots. And in fact, in Tutankhamun's tomb, there are a couple of war chariots. They're the sort of Ferraris of their day. They're incredibly light, incredibly fast vehicles, and they were, extremely expensive, and that's why, kings were depicted riding on them and so on. But yes, what's really amazing is that the Egyptians know about wheels for about 2,000 years and don't bother to use them.
Yes, and Egyptians and Mesopotamia, my geography is weak, but as I understand it, they are neighbors, aren't they? Meaning they would Egyptians also learned quite a few things from Mesopotamians, let's say writing and the like, but
exactly, we're not quite sure. It looks as though, I favor the theory that writing spreads from Mesopotamia to Egypt. We know there was trade between the two because there are Mesopotamian objects found in Egypt and vice versa, and writing appears roughly simultaneously in both places, but there's an ongoing academic debate about whether the Egyptians got the idea from the Mesopotamians or whether they sort of just happened to invent it at the same time. I'm more inclined towards the first of those explanations, but there is an active debate about that. So yes, there was definitely ideas being exchanged, and the wheel was an idea that spread very rapidly. And the Mesopotamians, frankly, didn't use the wheel for a great deal. I mean, the earliest depictions of wheels in Mesopotamian images. In particular, there's this wooden box called the Standard of Ur, and it's a sort of ceremonial box that depicts a procession and a war scene and things like that. Essentially, the wheeled vehicles were these rolling platforms that the king would go and watch battles from, and so they would be a sort of high up vantage point.
Right.
And they don't seem to have been, they didn't have steering at this point. These vehicles had a very large turning circle, and
Right.
and then of course they didn't have horses. Horses hadn't been domesticated at this stage yet either, so they were using these rather smaller animals to pull them along. So so mostly at that stage, vehicles were sort of expensive status symbols rather than
Right.
something that was actually terribly useful.
And was that one reason why folks didn't quite fancy people riding cars or these chariots or drawn, or rather even these carriages drawn by horses, because were they considered to be a little elite? I read somewhere where in your book where the rich would honk harder just to get the pedestrians out of the way when around the time when the first car or anything that resembled a car came along. So there was, it wasn't quite embraced in as a very good substitute to horses, which, as you write, was a very big source of manure and filth on the road. So
I'm sure we'll get to that, but I think the general picture is that the fortunes of wheeled vehicles sort of rise and fall. So initially you have people like the Egyptians saying, why should we bother with these? Then the war chariot is invented, and suddenly wheels are really, really cool and manly. And you get Egyptian kings. If you look at a wall carving of an Egyptian king, invariably he's firing a bow and arrow from the back of a chariot. And Assyrian imagery shows, kings are always depicted hunting and things at the backs of these fast chariots. So it's very, very cool. Then what happens is eventually horses are domesticated, and then horses are bred to be bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually they can carry a warrior in full armor, and that suddenly means you've got a way of traveling that's just as quick as a chariot, but it can go over uneven terrain, it can go over hills, and then cavalry becomes superior to chariots. And there's a famous battle between Persia and Greece under Alexander the Great, and the Persians lose, and Alexander is shown on his horse triumphant, while the king of Persia sort of skulks away in his chariot. And this was because at that particular battle, the Greek cavalry was clearly superior to the Persian war chariots, and so war chariots became sort of rather frowned upon. In fact, when the Romans get to Britain, they're surprised that, and that's quite a bit later, sort of 300 years later, so sort of 1st century BC. But when the Romans get to Britain, they're quite surprised that the local tribes here, who are then fighting the Romans, are still using chariots, because that's sort of old technology. We've moved on to horses and cavalry now, folks. Isn't that what you should be doing? And so then you get in the medieval period, the early medieval period, you get the whole idea of the knight and the sort of heroic knight on horseback, and it becomes positively frowned upon for men to go on wheeled vehicles. They are for women, and this is where we get this stereotype of the princess in the carriage, in the chariot. Well, it's not a chariot actually; it's because a chariot has 2 wheels and is a fast vehicle. So it's a sort of princess in a ornate carriage or coach with 4 wheels, and then the prince who is marrying the princess is always on horseback. He's never in the carriage with the princess, because women go in carriages, right? And this is the custom in the Roman period and later, that essentially wheeled vehicles are for women, and they're a way to protect women and to stop other people seeing them, whereas men are manly and go on horses, and women who go on horses they're thought to be a bit weird, and men who go in wheeled vehicles are thought to be a bit weird. And so yes, you do get this sort of thing. But then the fortunes of all of these things change again with the invention of gunpowder weapons. And gunpowder weapons mean that suddenly the knight on horseback is looks old-fashioned, because you can shoot him with a cannon or a gun or whatever. And then you can put these guns on the back of carriages, and this is something that in Central Europe becomes a form of war fighting, where you essentially make a fort of carriages that all have guns on them, and suddenly knights on horseback look old-fashioned, and suddenly men riding carriages, driving a new fast kind of carriage, and what the coach is called. So this is the origin of the coach, and the coach is a particularly fast new kind of carriage. I mean, it's nothing particularly different about it, except it's suddenly deemed to be cool. And so you get the idea of sort of men should learn to drive carriages, and that's now the coolest thing. And carriages are now status symbols. Rich people
Right.
have carriages, more than one carriage. They have their coat of arms on the side. They have glass windows. Suddenly, carriages are cool again. And so, what I'm really trying to get to here is, because what I'm interested in always
Mm.
is the social impact of technology and the interaction between new technologies emerging, but then how
Mm.
those technologies are received and what people think of them. And so, this is a really nice example of how wheeled vehicles kind of, have ups and downs. There's a bumpy road to their adoption. And then eventually, of course, you get to vehicles that can move on their own without the horses. You get steam
Right.
vehicles, you get cars. And now we have the idea of the car as the status symbol. Or is it still, is that falling out of favor as well? So that's what I'm trying to show. I'm trying to show the very, very long history of
Right.
this idea that you are what you drive.
Which places did you have to go to? What rabbit holes did you discover to be able to dig out stuff? There's a lot out there, but to be able to tell a story in a way that a layman can grasp it, how big a challenge was it? And how did you know what to leave out and what to keep in? Because even what you've summarized succinctly here is a big challenge to know, to be able to, put everything in a consumable manner for somebody
Yeah,
who's
well, that's
mildly interested. Yeah.
no, I mean that's the fun part of writing books, and in fact, I think of doing explanatory journalism. And the reason I'm primarily a science and technology journalist is that that tends to be the kind of journalism that where you have to explain stuff. You have to
Mm.
make complicated or new things comprehensible. And so I'm applying the same skills when I'm researching history. And
Right.
yes, I mean it's always the case that the largest amounts of synthesis and going down rabbit holes about depictions of wheeled vehicles on pots in various periods of history, trying to synthesize a
Right.
global narrative from lots of different strands of evidence from lots of different parts of the world is a
Mm.
challenge, but it's also what's fun about it. So yes, I always start off with when I've written these books that look at thousands of years of history of a thing, whether that's food or drink or media, or in this
Right.
case wheeled vehicles. I do start off in a lot of archaeological journals and reading that kind of thing. And a lot of it is archaeology to begin with, and ancient
Right.
history, and then it kind of gradually moves into other sources where you get sort of direct first person sources,
Right.
and so forth. And then I went to look at vehicles in various museums around the world, and that sort of thing. So yes, it's one of those topics. I've always been into cars since I was
Mm.
very small, and so it was one of those topics I always meant to write a book about, and so this is it.
Right. I think you tweeted this about a decade ago or something, or on Facebook, that one of your editors back in the day when you were not with the Economist had written some 30 commandments of writing, where one of them was that if you have a tangled bowl of spaghetti, a good storyteller will pull one strand of it, preferably with all the masala and whatever attached to it, and give that to the audience rather than confusing them with too much information. So you've done the hard yards to like archaeology and going to different places to put together something that folks can understand. And one of the interesting bits from your books is that social element that you talked about, the social
Yeah.
impact. Now, for instance, at the beginning, before the car came into being, into existence, it was the bike. Of course, there was railway, and then there came the bike. And I found it interesting that it was a symbol of romance, where it was okay for the tire to go flat. It would give folks to just chit chat and then take the bike back home while
Yeah.
they walk. Then there was drive-in. So was romance, or rather that a part of camaraderie, or I don't know how you would want to put it, a very key element for it to drive forth the whole
Yes,
industry.
no, I think it was. I have described bikes and bicycles and the popularity of the bicycle in the late 19th century as a sort of dating technology as much as anything else. So the kind of the equivalent of a dating app
Right.
today, and that was essentially because it was expensive to have a horse, and so most people didn't have horses
Right.
because you have to feed them the whole time, whether or not you're using them.
Mm.
And so a bicycle allowed people to travel much more quickly than they could walk, and it gave them the complete sort of freedom of movement that having a horse would give them, because you could go wherever there was a road, or even where there wasn't a road.
Mm.
And one of the things that bicycles do is they lead to these bicycle clubs are formed, and bicycle owners become quite effective lobbyists at getting roads improved. so that you can cycle around more easily and so on. So
Right.
there is there is, and in many ways they sort of pave the way for the car, because there are legal battles about whether you can do things like ride a bicycle in Central Park in New York and in other places, and so there
Right.
there are people saying no, we've only ever had horse-drawn carriages there, you can't have newfangled vehicles. And when they lose that, they have essentially paved the way for other newfangled vehicles like cars to go later. And of course, cars benefit from rubber tires and smoother roads as well. So there is very much this paving of the way for the car in the story of the bicycle. But yes, adoption for a lot of people was driven by the fact that you had this sense of freedom, and that meant that you could get to nearby villages. It essentially expanded the dating pool for people, because they could go further afield to see people, whether they were friends or whether they were romantic partners. And so that was very much something that people did. And there was a sort of moral panic around bicycles and how terrible this was. But yes, there are a lot of contemporary reports from people, from women saying, how to meet men on a bicycle, and saying that, an artfully arranged flat tire would cause, the right sort of man would come along and say, "Can I help you?" And maybe he'd fix the tire, or maybe he'd walk you home or whatever. But only a sort of chivalrous man would bother to stop and offer you help. So you were immediately filtering out the wrong sorts of folks right away. If they weren't going to stop, then you maybe didn't want to spend any time with them. So so there's a lot of discussion about the emancipation of women through bicycles as well. It gave women the freedom to move around more. And again, that was something that a lot of men disapproved of. But there is sort of a clear feminist strand to the adoption of the bicycle in the 1890s.
Right. And this there is a common theme sometimes, is that men, or it was quite biased towards men, in that I think there was an advertisement, a print ad that you have shown in your book back in 1910, which says even a woman can drive.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
It's clean, reliable, and not too many moving parts.
That's a slightly different thing, which is that electric cars, that's to do with electric cars. So electric in the 1890s, it really wasn't clear which technology was going to win. And in about, I think it's 1897, I think there's equal volumes of steam and electric and petrol engine cars being sold in America. So they're all sort of neck and neck at that point. I think in some years the electric cars actually have the lead. They are the most popular cars. So it is worth asking, well, why did we end up with the petrol cars? And the reason is that the electric cars didn't have very good range. The battery technology was very primitive, and of course there wasn't widespread electrical infrastructure. People didn't even have electricity in their houses a lot of the time. So plugging in your car was not an option, and if you drove somewhere else, there wasn't going to be a public charging point or anything like that. So electric cars really were at a disadvantage. And then steam cars, the big problem with steam cars is that it takes an hour or two for the boiler to heat up. So you really have to know that you want to go out quite a long time in advance, and you basically need a full-time employee to look after the car. So at that point you get a lot of people going from being carriage drivers or footmen to being people who look after cars for you and become your chauffeur. But that was very impractical. So the petrol car was less reliable to begin with, but it had the advantage that you could buy petrol at hardware stores because it was a cleaning product. So you could get it everywhere, and so you didn't worry about running out of fuel on the road. And so in the first decade of the 20th century, the petrol car emerges as the winning technology, and the companies that were making electric cars end up sort of marketing them just to women and saying, well, yes, we recognize that this is not the technology that is, that most people want. It's not fast and powerful enough for the manly male driver who wants to go on great adventures, but they're great for women. And this was the marketing line that was taken, because you didn't need to be strong to turn the handle to start the engine like you did with a petrol car. And so women were assumed to be weak and unable to do that. Also, petrol cars broke down the whole time, and men were assumed to be naturally, good at mechanics. And women were assumed not to be, because they, if nothing else, because they wouldn't want to get oil on their dresses or whatever. So the idea that electric cars you didn't have to be strong to start them. They were quiet. and they were easy to use. You didn't need to maintain them. They were reliable. Also, the fact that they had a short range was actually a feature, not a bug, from the point of view of the men who were buying cars for their wives, because it meant they couldn't go very far in them.
Oh, right.
I mean, they could drive into town and visit their friends, and then go to the opera, and then drive back again. But they couldn't, like, if they wanted to leave and run away, they couldn't run away in an electric car because they wouldn't get very far. In those days, you know, the best electric cars had a range of about 70 miles. So, and most of them had a range of about half that. So, yeah, so electric cars were by 1910 or so very much being aimed at women buyers, or at men buying them for women, and at women drivers. And that's why you get the adverts like you're talking about, you know, so easy to drive, even a woman can do it. Buy one for your wife or daughter, this sort of thing. And that idea that electric cars were kind of girly and inferior, and real men have petrol engine, all that sort of thing, that really did persist into the, you know, I think into this century. And it's only things like the Tesla Roadster, and other high performance electric cars that have really fought back against that. And that was very much the strategy with Tesla, which was to change the perception of electric cars by making them, you know, incredibly fast. And the original Tesla Roadster was often put up against, you know, Ferraris and Lamborghinis and things, and it could easily beat them in a drag race because it has such phenomenal acceleration. But of course, the whole modern electric car is made possible by a technology that didn't exist a century ago, the lithium battery. And so that wasn't an option back in the day, and so that's why we ended up with petrol cars, or one of the reasons.
And yet, as ironic as it is, the first person to use an automobile, you write, was a woman, Bertha Benz, the wife of Carl Benz. I love the story. Tell us about it. What did she do?
It's such a lovely story. And so Bertha Benz was Carl Benz's wife, and she helped him develop the first car. And if you look at the pictures of the first car, you know, it looks like more like a tricycle than a car, because it's made of bike parts. It's got bicycle wheels. It's got one front wheel. It's got this small internal combustion engine under the seat. And so Carl Benz develops this and drives it around in the yard of their house. And he keeps wanting to make it better, and, you know, he's not ready to launch it yet, and it's not really, you know, and she's like, no, come on, this is actually something that people would buy. It's really useful. So to make her point, his wife Bertha decides to go on the road trip, and it's like the first car road trip in history. So she goes off to see her mum, who lives about 50 miles away, across country, and she takes her two sons with her, which is quite useful actually, because it turns out that one of the problems with the original design of Benz's car was that it couldn't go up hills. It had a very weak low gear, so they had to push it up hills. But they could stop off at the chemist and buy the cleaning fluid that it's basically identical to petrol, and that was what it ran on. So they could the chemist where they stopped and did this has a plaque on the wall saying it's the first filling station in automotive history. But anyway, so she gets to her mother's that evening and sends him a telegram and says, I've got here. She's left him a note in the morning, by the way, saying, you know, I've gone to see my mum, I've taken the car, or words to that effect. And then she stayed there for a bit, and then she drove back again. And on the way back, she stopped at a cobbler's, and she had the brakes improved by having an extra layer of leather put on the brake pads, because the brakes weren't very effective at stopping the car going down hills. So she gets back and she goes, yeah, look, it's fine. It goes over long distances. You should probably make the low gear a bit lower so that it's easier for going up hills. And I've improved the brakes for you. And this gave Benz the confidence he needed to take the prototype car to essentially a trade show, an exposition, and he won the prize for the greatest invention at the exposition, and, you know, it was in all the papers, and that began the commercialization. You know, people started placing orders. So his wife gave him the confidence to sort of stop tinkering and get that, you know, that first product out there. And obviously it's been improved upon massively since then, but it's a sort of, you know, minimum viable product of the car. And so she pushed him to actually start promoting it and start selling it.
Right. The great artists ship is what the quote is.
Exactly. So he was just faffing. He was like letting
Right,
the perfect be the enemy of the good, and that was the
right,
problem. That it was like, look, just get it out there, and then of course, they start adding things to it, like the next version has 4 wheels instead of 3, and then someone
right.
invents the steering wheel, and because the cars originally had tillers, like boats, and so there were lots of improvements that came very rapidly after that.
And what explains the sudden, surge in folks in Europe and America owning cars, especially in the US? I read that you write in 1900, America had around 8,000 vehicles, and by 1920 it was 8 million, far,
Yeah,
far more
exactly.
than.
Yeah.
So what
No,
was that? What happened there?
well, the single biggest thing is the Model T Ford. But essentially, the car it's originally a plaything for the rich. And in the
Hmm,
1890s, it's just sort of rich people driving around and annoying everybody. And cars start to become a bit more affordable. But it really is the mass production of the Model T Ford that changes the game. And the Model T Ford is initially not built on a moving production line. So it's initially launched, I think it's in 1908, and it's a few years later that they improve the efficiency of the process. They do things like, famously get rid of all the color options except black, so that they don't have to make different colored ones, and they
right.
can just like make them all black, and then it's much simpler. This is
It's cheaper,
modern.
right? It was
Yeah,
just cheap.
but
Yeah,
it was cheap. It was the cheapest single color, so they just went for
right.
it. And then obviously the moving production line, where you have just cars moving along and people who do the same process, whether it's just like adding this screw or this nut or this bolt in a particular place or fitting this part onto it, and they're just doing the same thing over and over and
Hmm,
over and over again. And it's really boring, but it's very, very efficient because
effective.
they learn to do it. You don't need to train them very much, and
Right.
then they learn to do it. And so and then that meant that the efficiency of producing these cars shot up, and the price of the car came down, and it really was extraordinary. I mean, basically the design didn't change for about 20 years, which turned out to be a big problem because then the
Right.
Model T was obsolete. But really, what's amazing about it, and this is something that we think about today, we're used to the idea that computers get faster and cheaper, and we talk about Moore's law and all this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Moore's law is a more specific sort of computer industry version of a much deeper law
Hmm,
called Wright's law with a W. And Wright's law says that the more you make of something, and by that he means the more the human race makes of anything, the more practice people have in making something, the cheaper it gets. And you just see this, you can plot this for all sorts of things. But it's really striking with cars. If you think about it, the number of cars goes from 8,000 to 8 million. That's a 1,000-fold increase in the US.
hmm,
It's largely because of the Model T, and where it isn't the Model T, it's because other companies have copied the mass production model.
right.
So you've got a 1,000-fold increase in the number of cars in 20 years, and that's the same as doubling every 2 years 10 times.
Right.
Right, because
Right.
2 to the power 10 is 1,024. Right, so
Right.
what does doubling every 2 years sound like? It's Moore's law.
Moore's law. Right.
Right. So, and Moore's law, we kind of think, well, of course, it's easy to double things when they're tiny little transistors and they're, microscopic, and there are billions of them on a chip. But the idea that the same law applies to, 2-ton cars made
Cars.
of metal,
Yeah.
well, it does, it turns out. And
Right.
we're now seeing it with wind turbines, we're seeing it with solar panels, we're starting to see it with electric cars where the prices are starting to come down. So
Right.
the Model T is incredible because you get computer industry style and speed of
Hmm.
scaling, and that is what makes cars affordable. And so you get an enormous increase in volume and an associated drop in cost, and that makes cars something that are no longer just for the rich. They are something that ordinary people can afford to buy, and that's what the Model T Ford does.
Right. And I think Ford's factories, you make a mention somewhere, they became a spectacle for tourists to come and watch how the cars were being built
Yeah.
out
And
of
they
the
would
assembly line.
set
And
up
yeah.
exactly, and they would set up a sort of model production line or in fact, a real but small production line
Hmm.
at expositions, at trade shows, so that you could
Right.
come and see how it worked. But yes, it really was the wonder of the age, and people wanted to copy Ford's methods in lots of other areas. And in fact, one of the things that happens with fast food production,
Hmm.
and this of course is an outgrowth of the car, because people driving wanted to be able to eat quickly, and so then you get these drive-ins and drive-throughs where they wanted to be able to manufacture food very, very quickly. And so you end up with a fixed menu, a very small
Mm.
menu of options. So you take away choice, like you do with the Model T only being available in black.
Right.
And then you manufacture all of your, burgers the same way from the same parts. So you're fitting together
Mm.
parts on a production line. So that if you look at the way that McDonald's, evolves, they're essentially copying Fordism. They're applying mass production and the
Right.
production line to food. And
Right.
so that's sort of repaying the favor, because it's drivers who obviously are interested in being able to eat quickly.
And Ford, it is well documented that Ford also paid their workers a little bit more so that they could go on to further, buy the cars that they make as compared to others. And then, but however, I think later, as you said, for 20 years, they did the same thing. I think General Motors came in and figured out, we need to market this well. And I think they beat them to it. But how would
Yes.
Ford or Sloan react to, entrepreneurs today who talk about, hey, it's perfectly fine not to own a car? And you talk about, wasn't it Netflix for cars was a model by someone similar to
Yeah. No,
software
exactly.
as a service.
Yeah.
So
No,
how does that?
all good questions. I mean, just going back to Ford paying people more, what
Yeah.
Ford found was that but raising wages saved him money, because if he paid better than other car manufacturers, he would
Right.
keep. I mean, the turnover, the churn of workers was incredibly high, because working long hours in car factories was really boring.
Right.
And so, but what he found was that if he paid people more, fewer people left. And then he
Yes.
didn't have to spend so much time training people. And then he also didn't have to spend time training people, because the production line jobs were individually all very simple. There was something
Right.
like, 5,000 steps to making a Model T, and you only had to learn to do one of them.
Right.
And so, so actually he found that, he said at one point that one of the biggest savings I ever made was paying people more money. And it
Right.
was essentially because it reduced turnover of his workforce. But no, what
Right.
happened was ultimately that the Fords, make it really efficiently, but cheaply. The problem with that was that it didn't move with the times, and they added a couple of things to the Model T, but it basically looked the same by the mid 1920s. And what by that stage, the American consumer had moved on, and the idea that that everyone should have the same car and it should be a Model T, that was which was the case. I mean, the Model T was the majority; it was the most popular car sold. In many years, it was more than 50% of cars sold,
Right.
around the world. But eventually, what started to happen is that General Motors stole the idea of low cost manufacturing, but it started to have this much more differentiated product line, and it had multiple brands. And it, in many cases, its cars were the same under the hood, but they would have different styling and different colors. And the idea of car as self-expression, and in particular, the idea that you should get a new car, that reflected your status in life. When you got a promotion, you should get a new car to show that you'd moved up in the world. And so, and they made all this possible with the styling and the use of colors, but also by helping with the financing. So Ford was very old-fashioned. He didn't offer financing plans. He said, look, if you want to buy a car, you have to give me all the money up front, and I'll give you the car. It's as simple as that. And he thought lending people money was actually immoral. He thought that it would encourage people to spend beyond their means. And General Motors, by contrast, said, no, we'll help you we'll buy a car, we'll help you trade in your old one, and and here's our ladder of brands, and you should always be looking at. And they also did things like introduce a new model, a new version of every model every year, to make you to make you want to. So suddenly last year's model looks a bit old-fashioned. And how does that relate to today? Well, I think one of the things that's interesting is that if you look at smartphones now, they are manufactured on a production line, like Ford's are, but they're sold like GM. Because you have different models. There's a new one every year. Apple changes the position of the cameras, so you can tell if it's last year's model or not, right? Because has it got the diagonal camera? Has it got 3 of them? And will next year's have 4? I don't know. So it's very much and then you've got different colors, and then the idea that there's a different model for different people, and I have that kind of model, and you have that kind of model. So this idea of self-expression through technology, in many ways, the smartphone is the sort of inheritor of
Mm.
the legacy of the car. And if and certainly in many cities, if you go somewhere like Tokyo, owning a car in Tokyo is really impractical. So
Right.
the way you express yourself through your ownership of technology has long been through your phone, and how you customize your phone, and what the ringtone is, and what's on the screen, and the accessories you put on it, and what the case looks like, and all this kind of stuff. It's very much a sort of moving on from car culture into phone
Mm.
culture. And I think the other way in which the smartphone is the successor to the car is that, yes, you don't need to own a car anymore to get around a city. You just need a phone, because Google Maps will tell you the easiest way to use the transit system, and tell you
Right.
when the buses and trains are going to arrive, which makes buses and trains much easier to use. But also you can call a car, whether it's an Uber or another kind of taxi, using your phone. And so owning a car has become more of a hassle in a big city,
Yeah.
because you have to park it, and you have to pay for driving in the
Yes.
center
I-
in London and that kind of thing.
In
Yeah.
fact, in Bangalore, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you,
Oh,
Tom, but
do you have that in Bangalore now?
in Bangalore, yes, I've got a friend who says that going out on weekends is a bit of a pain, because it might take him half an hour just to get to a place which is 2 kilometers away. So he would rather
Is
order
that
it.
just
So
traffic then?
it's
Is
yeah,
that traffic?
the
Right. Okay. Yeah.
traffic. Yeah,
Okay. I
that
mean,
too.
traffic is obviously you're going to have the same. If
Yeah,
even if you're in an Uber, you're going to have traffic. But
yeah,
I think that basically car ownership is becoming more inconvenient, and car non-ownership is becoming more
yeah.
convenient because of technology, because you've got these other options of being able to summon a ride,
Right.
or find a ride, I know you've also got things like scooters and bikes that you can
Yes.
unlock with your phone, and so on. So the smartphone is sort of your ticket to mobility. I call this the Internet of Motion in the
Mm.
book, because what the smartphone has made possible is to stitch together what were previously separate modes of transport. So in London, we've got trains, we've got tubes, we've got
Yeah.
buses, we've got taxis, we've got trams in some parts of the city, we've got scooters, we've got bikes, and they were all
Yeah.
separate things. And now you can actually pay for all of them and find all of them using one device, which is your phone, and it's your sort of universal transport ticket. So
Right.
that's a big shift, and I think that's the direction we're going in. And what that means is that more and more people are saying, actually, I don't need to own a car. I can rent one when I need one. I can
Mm.
call one when I need one. If I want to go away for the weekend, sure, I might rent a car for that, but the rest of the time I'll do without them. And then, yes,
Right.
there is this kind of Uber for cars, Netflix for cars model, where you subscribe to a car. And I
Yeah.
know someone who's doing this, and you, instead of paying the lease payment on your car, you just pay. I think she pays £400 a month or something for the car, and that covers the insurance, it covers the charging because it's an electric car,
Right.
and then at any point you can just stop paying and they take the car away. But it also means if she wants a bigger car, she just say, well, this month I'm going to pay £500, and they bring her a
Mm.
different car that's bigger, and then she has that car for a month, and then she'll
Right.
say, okay, I'll go back to the smaller one now. And so it's a very competitive way of
Mm.
owning a car, compared with actually the hassle of buying one.
Right.
And so I think we're going to see more of that kind of thing.
Yes, there are a couple of startups in India that are experimenting with this. There is one called Zoom Cars, which allows you to rent a car like Hertz, but then they also have a subscription model that, a
Right.
couple of them are trying to do that. So, what does that mean for car makers? Is that, I mean, for them, do things change because the middle class will not buy, or do you
Yeah, no,
see?
I think it does. It should
Yeah,
mean that there's
it,
less demand for
let's.
cars. I mean, if you think about it, cars are, we only use them about 4% of the time. So
Mm.
they are, for many people, the second most expensive thing they own. And
Right.
yet I mean, you use your mattress more than you use your car, and way more, which is why, you should always, if you can
Yes.
afford to, spend money on a mattress, because it's
Correct.
like it's the thing that you use the
Yeah.
most. I mean, it's like that on your phone. You're on your phone when you're awake, and you're on your mattress when you're asleep. So buy a good mattress.
Right.
It's a really good investment. Whereas buying an expensive car is kind of silly, because
Mm.
you hardly use it. I mean, it's mostly not used, and most of cities are just filled up. They're really kind of dormitories for cars. I mean, I'm looking out my window now. I can see my car, yes, and I can see lots of other cars, and they're mostly just sitting here all day.
Yeah.
And so that is a bit daft. And so
Yeah.
if we do end up with these models where we are only calling cars or paying for cars when we need them, and we're in effect
Mm.
sharing them with other people in various ways, whether that's sharing through Uber or with a rental car where maybe I'm not using it next month and then maybe you rent the same one.
Yeah.
That would mean that yes, the total number of cars that we need, it goes down. That's bad for car makers because they're not
Mm.
selling so many and having to make so many. Electric cars also seem to last longer, which is problematic, I think, for car makers.
Right.
But ultimately that's good for cities because we waste a huge amount of space on parking, and we could use that space for something else, and we could have parks, and we could have playgrounds, and we could have eating outdoors, and we don't need some American cities are 40% parking
Right.
by area. It's mad. So I
Wow.
think fewer cars would be good. And I think during the pandemic we saw what a lifestyle that uses less cars looks like.
Yes.
And we had many streets in many cities converted to pedestrian use and that sort of thing, so that people could eat outside, and it was lovely. And many parts of many places in Europe certainly have decided to keep some of those less car centric road arrangements, and I think it's a big improvement.
Yes, and after the pandemic, we are back to square one. In fact, there was Mumbai police tried this. I'm not sure if this viral video you've seen this, where because we love to honk horns even when the traffic light is red, what they did was they set up a little meter that would, consume, or rather would record the decibel levels of the horns, and if it goes beyond 85 decibels, then the traffic light would turn back to red, just to discipline.
Just stop everyone beeping. Right.
Yes,
right. Okay,
yes. So it was an experiment. I mean, I don't think they went with it, but it went viral, and that's the whole idea. Where I think you also touch about right about how it was thought that once we switch from horses to cars, it'll be a far cleaner environment. But then today, as we look at whether it's Delhi or Mumbai or cities which a good person, I'm not suggesting that the significant percentage of the pollution is down to cars, but yes, carbon monoxide.
No, a lot of it is. But no, you're right. I mean, so a lot of the book does focus on the externalities of transport. And for horse transport, that was enormous amounts of horse manure on the streets. And in fact, the book starts with that scenario in the 1890s, which I think is a very similar. The reason I start there is that I think we face a very similar situation today, which is that we have recognized that the way we do road transport in cities is unsustainable environmentally. And the reason it is now is because of the particulates, but mainly because of the carbon dioxide that's causing climate change. And so we've recognized that we need to sort of rethink how we can't get to the point where everyone in the world has a car. That's just not going to work.
Right.
And so this is very similar to what happened in the 1890s, where big cities, New York and London are the classic examples, were becoming unsustainably dependent on horses. So what was happening was that the more commerce was being done, the more trade, the more horses you needed to move everything around, the more you built railways to move people between cities, which you would have thought might help, the more that actually increased the demand for horses, because when people get off the railway trains, they then needed a horse to take them to their final destination. So you get and so what happened was that the ratio, the number of horses per person in those cities was going up, and the traffic was getting worse and worse, and the horse manure was piling up, and that was causing health problems. And so there was this general recognition in the 1890s that there was a big problem. And then the car comes along, and everyone goes, oh, this is it, this is going to fix everything. No horse manure, so the pollution problem goes away. Of course, that turned out not to be true. But it was also thought that cars would be much safer, because a horse can sort of get scared and kick you, or it can run away. And so there were all of these accidents caused by horses, and it was assumed that cars would be much safer. Also turned out not to be true. Cars are absolutely deadly. And then there was the question of traffic, and the idea was that if you replaced a horse and a cart with a car, the car's about half the size, so you would free up half the space on the road straight away, and that would mean you'd get rid of all the traffic jams, and everything would flow much more smoothly, and it would all be much quicker. But of course, as soon as that space appears on the road, people look at it and go, you could get a car in there. And then and so you get this phenomenon of induced demand, which is whenever the traffic is flowing smoothly, people look at it and go, oh, okay, I'll join that, I'll get on the road. And so then it all fills up again. So all of those things turned out to be wrong. And so my point is, we're facing a similar problem today, that we have just as they had all these problems with traffic and road accidents and pollution, we have problems with traffic and road accidents and pollution. And the Victorians made what they thought was an obvious choice that would solve all these problems, and it turned out to bring a whole load of new problems along on its own. So my question is, if we're going to make the right choice now, how do we avoid falling into those traps that they made. And is it the case that self-driving cars will like solve all these problems, which is one of the things that's, again, people are saying self-driving cars will get rid of traffic and stop road accidents, and they'll be electric, so there'll be no pollution. And it's that sounds like a great deal, but we've heard this one before. So
right.
So I'm saying we need to be a little bit skeptical.
Yes, at some point, I think driverless cars you talked about, I think in China, isn't that right? Just last month they started, or I read, I think in Wall Street Journal, a journalist hailing a driverless taxi, which is
yes, no, there are some. There are a couple of places in America, and now a couple of places in China as well, where you can go in a driverless taxi, and it is really truly driverless. There isn't a safety driver there. There is literally nobody in the front. Yes, there's a company that's doing this in San Francisco, and Google has been doing it for some time in Chandler, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix. So yes, there are a few examples of this, and I think it does quietly seem to be progress on this. Obviously, the claims that were made about this 5 years ago have not panned out, but I think this technology is going to work eventually. And I think part of the reason it'll work is that in many cases, particularly in China, where it's easier to do it, the actual environment of the city is being modified to make it easier for the self-driving cars. And I think Singapore has talked about doing the same thing as well. So in those sorts of countries where the government can sort of basically do what it wants, they can say, right, we're going to have only autonomous taxis in this district of the city, and we're going to put in all the infrastructure that we need to make sure they don't get confused. I think that would be harder in America because people are very attached to their cars as symbol of freedom, that kind of thing, like guns as well. So so if you start saying this no human driven cars in this town or in this neighborhood, then people are going to freak out. But I think that is something we are going to see in some parts of the world. So I think mass adoption of autonomous vehicles is much more likely to happen in China first than anywhere else.
Right. And also in terms of laws usually catching up with technology a little later, even this will play out the same way, right? Because I remember, I mean, you've written about how the onus of traffic accidents that killed people was initially on the drivers, but then they lobbied, and then it fell back to the pedestrians that, hey, you are the guys who are making mistakes. You should not be jaywalking.
Exactly.
Is a term that
the invention of jaywalking. So yes, jaywalking was a very clever propaganda campaign by the car makers to essentially demonize pedestrians and say, if you're in an accident, it's your fault. If you're a pedestrian, it's the pedestrian's fault, and the driver is not at fault. And it's a similar thing actually, which is sort of just as I was talking about modifying the urban landscape to make it easier for autonomous cars, what the story of the last 100 years has been modifying the urban landscape to make things easier for drivers. So we give them, right of way on the roads, priority, and all of this new infrastructure like signs and traffic lights has to go in, and then parking is provided for them, and all this sort of thing. And so cities really have been taken over by cars, and previously it was the case that you could walk into the road was a shared space between all sorts of between horses and people and animals. Well, the interesting thing is, actually, if you want to see that now, go to India. I mean, don't have to say that to you, but I mean, obviously it's not the case in downtown Mumbai or Delhi, but certainly if you're in the countryside or in a smaller town in India, you do get this. I think it really is exactly what it was like. And if you look at film of what it was like on the streets of America in the early 20th century, it's very, very similar, because you have animals walking around. So you've got like random cows and occasional elephants in India, but then you've also got some horse-drawn vehicles, you've got some cars, you've got bicycles, you've obviously got motorbikes. So you have this, and then you've got pedestrians, and everyone gets along. The speed of the vehicles and the people, everyone's roughly going at the same speed, which is kind of walking speed. And so you'll have seen those amazing time-lapse videos of like Indian junctions where everything looks like it's going to crash into each other, and it never quite does. And it's just because it's all sped up 100 times.
No, absolutely. And another favorite trick that people do when they cross the road, do you know what it is? There is a speeding vehicle, and the person who's crossing the road would just put his hand out, and that is the sign that, hey, you've got to stop. I am going to cross the street. And there are Twitter internet memes or Twitter memes where
Oh, of people
there is
of that, yeah.
there's a light coming out of your or like a
Right. Yeah,
saber. I mean,
exactly, exactly.
people are doing this, and I mean, they just put their palm out and then
I'm
vehicles
always
stop.
amazed when I cross the road in India, or this was also true in Sri Lanka when I went there a
Yeah.
couple of years ago. And when I'm with a local, they just like walk out into the traffic, and I'm just like,
Yes.
you can't do that, you'll get squashed. And it's
Yes.
because we have having grown up in Europe, it's a very it's very much like if you step into the road, you
Hmm.
shouldn't be there. It's for cars, and if a car hits you, it's your fault. And this has
Right.
been drummed into us because of the jaywalking,
And J
propaganda
and I
campaign
think what
of
I
the
liked
20s.
was the J stands for a country bumpkin who can't get his way around
Exactly.
a city. So it was very derogatory at the time that, hey, if you're doing that, it's
Exactly. It was
your
like
fault. Yeah.
don't be a country bumpkin,
Yeah.
and that was what it was, a jaywalker, and yes, it was a very disparaging way of referring to people. And so instead the idea was you should only cross at the corners, and obviously a lot of American cities have got a grid system, and so the
Hmm.
idea was you just cross between at the corners of the blocks,
Right.
and always at right angles, never diagonally. And so that really was, that
Ah,
was taking away the freedom of the streets. And I think one of
right.
the good things about the pandemic was reclaiming streets for other
Yes.
uses and taking them away from cars. And in fact, to be fair, in Britain, we've just changed the highway code so that essentially the more vulnerable road user has priority. So pedestrians have priority over cyclists, and cyclists have
Oh,
priority over cars. And you really can see the difference when I go for a walk, and I have a particular route that I do when I walk around the block. And when I get to the junctions and there's a car coming, they have to slow down and
no.
stop. And that's not how it used to be. It used to be the case that if there was a car coming, you waited till it went past and then you crossed safely. But now the onus is on the driver, and this really is a change.
Right.
And it really is
Right.
sort of turning back the clock by 100 years, because that's the way things used to be.
And with the advent of electric vehicles now, back to you spoke about what
Yeah.
happened back in 1910, and now with Teslas of the world coming in, do you see that? I mean, I think all the major automakers have said that we are going to be switching to electric vehicles in due course. So is there going to be a mass adoption? Because right now the price at which it is being sold is high, and also the second part of the question, in the interest of time, I know we have just 10
Yeah.
minutes, is even the whole concept of sustainable cars, because the environment is important, the CO2 emissions and the like.
Yeah.
How do you see that debate panning
So
out?
I mean, yes, it's very clear that the direction of travel is towards electric cars, and I think more and more countries are basically banning petrol cars from, say, 2030, 2035, and I think it will be very difficult to buy one after that
Right.
anywhere. And this is a good thing. At the moment, electric cars are generally quite expensive. That said, actually, if you look at China, which is I think the biggest market for electric cars, the most popular models are very, very small, cheap models. So it's not in the West, Tesla really has changed the game, but Teslas are expensive cars, right? So I think the sort of smaller, lighter electric vehicles that we see in places like China and India are just as much the way things are going. And in fact, one of the things I think that we're going to see is the emergence of vehicles that are sort of in between a bicycle and a car in size. Cars do
Right.
not need to be as big as they are, particularly in America. They're ridiculously large. I mean, they're bigger than some American house. Sorry, some European houses. Some of them. I mean, they are absolutely gigantic and heavy and inefficient. So I think yes, there's clearly a move towards electric propulsion, and then provided those vehicles are charged using renewable energy, then you
Right.
haven't got any CO2 emissions. And I mean, you've got the CO2 emissions in manufacturing, but in the long run, well, even in the medium term, you come out ahead. And so this is, in the grand scheme of things, this is a necessary part of dealing with climate change, which is decarbonizing road transport. It's actually one of the easier problems to solve because we know how to do it. We've got the technology, and provided you then decarbonize the electrical grid, which is happening anyway, then you've basically decarbonized road transport. In fact, I mean, people think that this is a big component of dealing with climate change. It's not even that big. It's about 10% of the problem is emissions from small, basically cars and trucks, so people cars, and then about the same again from road transport of other kinds, so delivery lorries and so on. You can probably electrify those as well. What's more difficult is decarbonising industry, steel making, cement, things like that, and decarbonising shipping and decarbonising aviation. And again, aviation is 3 or 4% of global emissions, but there isn't an easy way to electrify them. Whereas with cars, with road transport, there is a very clear solution, which is you switch to electric, and you electric powered by renewable energy, and the emissions problem goes away. And so it's clear that we're on that path now. Adoption is accelerating because of high energy prices and uncertainty. People don't like the fact that when war breaks out, the price of energy goes up, and then the price of petrol goes up, and whereas if you've got an electric car, the price of charging that goes up as well, but it goes up by a lot less because charging cars with electricity is generally cheaper than putting petrol in them. So it's clear that Tesla has achieved its goal of getting the world to go towards electric cars. And in fact, it's interesting, the share price of Tesla has fallen in part because other car makers are now so committed to electric cars that the idea that Tesla is going to sort of completely dominate this market clearly isn't true. Other car makers are getting very good at making electric cars. Some of the big brands have really figured this out, and so as a result, Tesla is less exceptional and less exciting than it was, and I think that's one of the reasons its share price has fallen. The other, of course, is that Elon Musk is distracted by Twitter, but let's not go there.
Right. And also, what about the arguments against electric vehicles? That are they as green as they are made out to be? For instance,
to be honest, I know you can make
cobalt,
those arguments.
For example, you write about how cobalt has to be.
That's true. I mean, that's a kind of human rights thing rather than a greenery thing, because cobalt is mined in a couple of politically unstable places with a lot of child labor and very, very low safety standards, or none at all. But I mean, if you look at the latest Teslas, that they use a cobalt-free battery. There are battery technologies, battery chemistries now that don't rely on cobalt. So I think that's how you solve that problem. You do still need a lot of lithium, but there does seem to be quite a lot of lithium around. But one of the big challenges there is geopolitical, which is that most lithium in the world is refined in China, and you don't want to be reliant on China if you're a European car maker, because if there's a war in Taiwan or something, then we may end up imposing sanctions on China, and then you can't get any lithium. So there are different supply chain questions being asked. But I think whenever I hear people say electric cars are just as bad as petrol cars, or even worse, because all of the if you throw away your petrol car then and buy a new car, then the carbon associated with emitting with manufacturing it is terrible, and then it's got all of these rare earth metals, and they all have to be mined, and so you should stick with petrol. I think it's a stupid argument, because it's generally advanced by people who really, really like petrol cars or work for oil companies. The efficiency of manufacturing electric cars is going to go up. Initially they are expensive, and but Wright's law, let's go back to that, right? The more you make of something, the cheaper it gets, the better we get at making it, the more efficient we get at making it. And also I think a lot of electric cars are going to be these smaller vehicles that use less steel, produce fewer emissions in manufacturing, require less lithium in the battery, and so on. So I don't buy this we're better off sticking with petrol cars. That's just a silly argument. And yes, obviously there is a switching cost, but it's a switching cost that we need to suck up. And also, the world car fleet turns over every 10 years anyway. So so fine, don't buy an electric car next year, wait 3 years and buy one when they're cheaper. But we're all going to end up with them if we own cars.
Or I think everyone's going to rent cars anyway.
Oh yeah, or exactly. Whatever means of access we have to cars, they're going to be electric cars that we end up in.
Right. But what I particularly enjoy, and I think this is for the readers, is that when you write about electric cars, I think there is an advertisement, if you can see, back in 1957. Yes. And let me just read this out for the ones listening. And this is a 1957 ad for America's electric light and power companies. It depicts a driverless car, is what you write. One day, your car may speed along an electric superhighway. Its speed and steering automatically controlled by electronic devices embedded in the road. Travel will be more enjoyable. Highways will be made safe by electricity. No traffic jams, no collisions, no driver fatigue. I think they're a little too optimistic at the end, but it was quite, Well,
of course, that's an ad for it's not even an ad from a car company. I think it's an ad from an electrical provider.
Right.
Yeah, so they're
Yeah.
basically saying, because obviously if you're selling electricity, then you want the whole of road transport to be electrical, because then everyone has to
Right.
buy the power from you. So, so that,
Right.
remember what the vested interests are. But yes, it is a very familiar sounding promise that we will have these self-driving electric cars that will make our lives easier, and they'll go a lot faster, and they'll be safer. And that has yet to arrive. And so I think if there's one message you take away from my book, it's the sort of cautionary tale that when these sorts of promises are made about wonderful new forms of road transport, they need to be taken with a pinch of salt.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Tom, for your time on this podcast. It was enjoyable. Loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Great to talk to you.
Thank you. And Tom, there was one more. I remember one. You must have seen this, a very famous BBC documentary where they talk about how crows in Japan have figured out a way around breaking their nuts that they can't break with their beaks. They would,
right.
They would go
no,
to
what do they
signal.
do? They drop them, or they get cars to drive over them?
Yeah, they would get cars to drive over them, and then they would wait.
Crows are incredibly clever, and they use tools, and they also have sort of culture in the sense that they can teach. You get groups of crows that figure out something, and then they can teach each other how to do it. They also seem to be able to recognize individual humans.
Yes.
So, and they can remember humans. So I mean, they are extremely clever. So that doesn't surprise me.
And they would stop until the signal would turn red. Yes. So that people would start walking on the road, and that would be their cue to go in there. They won't even fly. They would just walk onto the footpath.
Oh, right.
Nibble.
There you
go.
And
then that's evolution. I don't know where.
They are amazing. They are amazing. So there you are.